certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Kira Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
In February 1988, Bradley Edwards, the man accused of the Claremont serial killings, attacked a teenage girl sleeping in her bed. Today, she faced her attacker in court. Thanks for joining us for day 10 of Claremont in Conversation. I'm Natalie Bongiolo. Also in the studio today, we've got Tim and Alison Fan. Hello both.
Hi there.
Guys.
So you were both in court today, and I can only imagine this must have been a very daunting experience for this witness today.
Well, she actually did know him because they went to school together, but of course she didn't identify him on that night. She didn't really look at him, did she, Tim? She just gave her testimony. He looked down most of the time. He looked a little bit sheepish or just a bit, he didn't seem to express much, but she recounted these rather bizarre details of not being panicked by the attack because she thought it was her boyfriend when she woke up and found someone on top of her. So she didn't scream straight away. She thought her boyfriend had come in and put his hand over her so he wouldn't wake up the parents who were sleeping in the next bedroom. It was only when she said, I love you, thinking again it was her boyfriend, that he leapt off and she reached up and touched his face and realised it wasn't her boyfriend. So she recounted that in great detail today.
And strong and clear, very clear in her recollection. And, I mean, you could physically see this lady steeling herself for the you know, which I'd call it an ordeal, because it would be. You know, the court was packed again, so we got the impression that, well, certainly the lady's sort of closest supporters obviously knew it was coming today. And, yeah, I mean, when she walked into court, you could sort of see herself steeling herself. But once she got on the stand, she was clear, she was precise, she was meticulous in the detail that she went through. I mean, she was just a really impressive witness in terms of a legal standpoint, but then everything else that went with it, and the fact that she chose to do it herself. So,
I was going to say, why was she there as opposed to giving a statement?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So right at the start, even before we knew for sure that this was going to be the witness, Mr. Jovich, Mr. Edwards, his barrister, got onto his feet and said, I just want to say something about the first witness. And he said, we have said for a long time that we don't need this witness to give evidence herself. We were happy for the statement to be read in. We just want to make that point clear to the judge. And the judge said, well, yeah, I take that point on board. And then Miss Barbara Gallows stood up and basically said, Your Honour, this is this witness's positive preference to do this in person, you know.
I think she wanted her day in court.
She wanted
to explain it all. And, of course, he's pleaded guilty to this charge.
Well, and that's the other thing. So there's no prejudice as such for her to give her evidence in person. And Mr. Jovich did not ask one question of her, so he was, you know, good to his word. He didn't cross-examine her at all.
Yeah. So you're saying she was quite meticulous in her evidence today. Can we talk through her evidence? It's Valentine's Day, 1988. She's at home, and what's happened? She's gone to bed that night, or just step out her evidence for us.
Sorry, Alan.
Well, she mentioned that he was distressed, her boyfriend, so she just naturally presumed when she woke up that he had come back to the house. So
she spent the evening with her boyfriend,
has she? Spent the day, Valentine's Day.
Yeah, the whole day. And, I mean, her description was that, well, you know, we were
hugging
and kissing all day. It had been a nice day. He'd shaved, you know, and then something's happened. She didn't go into much detail about that towards the end of the night, and he's left the house distressed. So,
and she thought it was him coming back.
Yeah.
So she didn't panic at first. It was only.
So is she woken by noises, or what happens next?
No, she was woken by the physical presence of a man on top of her. So she even described it that, you know, I was sleeping on my stomach with my hands under the pillow. That's how I always sleep. That's how I still sleep now. And then suddenly I felt this presence on top of me, either side of me, and I was woken up. I was startled. I was surprised, but as Ali said, I wasn't shocked because in her sort of obviously
she said it's okay, I won't scream. Thinking again, it's her boyfriend.
Yeah.
When he put the hand over her mouth, she said it's okay, I won't scream, because again she's thinking all the time it's her boyfriend, who apparently is her husband right now.
That's
so
correct.
It was a general feeling of tenderness for the guy, and then she thought he'd come back, didn't want to wake the parents who were sleeping in the next room. It was only when she reached up and touched his face to stroke his face, she said, thinking again it's her boyfriend. She felt the stubble, and it didn't feel like her boyfriend's face. That's when she
dug her nails in.
She dug her fingernail in, yeah.
So she said it was in that much detail. I knew my husband had boyfriend then had shaved that day because it was Valentine's Day. I reached behind me, so she'd been struggling, sort of shaking her head from side to side to try and sort of loosen this what felt like an attack. She leaned back, felt the stubble, and realised at that moment that it wasn't her boyfriend.
And even when he put that bit of fabric in her mouth, she thought it was a bit of the doona.
Yeah.
So she wasn't freaked.
She
wasn't freaking
fabric
out.
over her face.
She thought some fabric in her mouth, and she thought her doona had actually somehow come loose, and she'd got a mouth over it. So none of this was someone frightened at first. It was only when she realised it was a stranger, and then he got off. Then she looked at a man standing in the doorway wearing a white nightie. Then she started screaming, "Dad, Dad, Dad!" And they
so
came
it's
in.
after she's dug her nail in. The pressure has eased a little bit, and then she described it as he just sort of almost levitated himself off, landed with a light. And this is the type of detail. Landed light-footed on her carpeted bedroom, and then she braced herself, awaiting what she thought might be another attack. She thought she was going to be punched or struck in some way. That didn't come. She looked over her shoulder and saw this sight of this 6'1" figure, almost as tall as the door frame, wearing a white cotton long sleeve women's nightie. So this incident is obviously burned into her brain because, we've said it before, she would have gone over the statement numerous times. She would have been proof. She would have discussed this with the prosecution. She would have gone through this with the police. But it's a completely different environment to what she had to go through today.
Yes.
What she chose to go through today. And the way she did it, it was obvious that every one of those details are seared into her brain in such a way that she hardly stumbled at all. She hardly flubbed her words or got mixed up with the time or anything. It was just, as I say, it was just a really impressive piece of public speaking, if you want to put it like that,
and luckily,
for someone under so much pressure.
And luckily, he left behind the kimono.
Well, that's
the kimono and the black stockings, because it was the kimono that actually linked right to the arrest of Bradley Edwards.
So she has seen him there, and then, Ali, you mentioned that she started yelling, "Dad, Dad, Dad." What's happened after that?
Well, the parents came in and called the police. It wasn't until, I believe, sometime later she would have found out, maybe not till he was identified with the kimono arrest, that she found out that she knew Bradley Edwards. He was a friend of her brother's. They'd gone to the same primary school, the same high school, mixed in various same groups. But she would not have found that out till we all did, till he was till the kimono.
Presumably when on the day he was arrested and charged with that crime, because that was one of the, as we said yesterday, the charge for Sarah's murder didn't come till much later in the legal process. But when he was charged with the murders of Jane and Kira, he was also charged with the Huntingdale attack, which up until then we didn't really know anything about, and he was also charged with the Karrakatta rape, which we knew something about. But on that day, when Commissioner Carlo Callaghan stood up and relayed all those charges to us, that was the first time that it had been publicly linked by police, the rape and the two murders. So yeah, I mean, obviously she would have been given some notice by the police, but not much, given that he was only arrested on the 22nd of December and charged and appeared in court on the 23rd. So, I mean, 1988 to
30
2016, 28 years
Yeah.
of wondering. And then,
Turns out he's a classmate.
God knows what her reaction would have been when the police have knocked on her door and said, Bradley Robert Edwards. I mean, the light bulb must have gone off, I suppose.
Maybe, yeah. Some other bits and pieces on the bed, wasn't there?
Yeah,
Black
there was
stockings.
a black stockings, knotted, and
material.
another piece of material. And what the prosecution will say about that is the the build up, the planning,
Propensity.
the planning really, because if you remember with the Karakata rape, which he's also admitted to, there was this sort of pre-knotted piece of wire or string that he's taken with him then as well. So they will definitely in the future and in previous hearings have pointed to that to say, well, look, this wasn't just some random sort of spur of the moment thing. This was he planned to do this because he brought some of the tools of the trade
along
with
with
him.
Well, we've heard a lot about this idea that there would be this DNA evidence linked with the kimono to other situations, but he wasn't wearing the kimono. Or we don't know whether he was wearing that at some point.
Unless he had it on top, because he had, when she saw him, she said like a long white nightie. It wasn't hers.
Yeah, well, it was certainly on his person, because she was asked specifically today, did anyone in your family, anyone in your home own an item of clothing like that? She said no. The stockings, she even made a slight joke about, does anyone in your house own a pair of black stockings? She said, I hope not. But I mean, and we can talk about this with such certainty because Mr. Edwards has admitted it. So he's admitted that was him.
Yep.
Yes.
He's admitted
There is no
that is
question.
his kimono,
Yep.
and the link to the kimono and him was the DNA. And as Ali alluded to, through all the myriad steps getting to where we are today, that kimono was probably the biggest breakthrough of all, because once they found that in the evidence box in the cold case, they were able to match that to Kira and the Karakata victim, which led them to further investigations into Huntingdale. There was a break-in, there was fingerprints found. They ran the fingerprints up Mr. Edwards' name from the Hollywood hospital attack, which we've discussed earlier in the week, and here we are.
It might be a good time just now, because we're talking about this. We've got a question from a listener, Sarah Brown, and she's asking, we often hear of trials where similar former charges are suppressed as to not influence the jury, or in this case, the judge's decision on the matter before the court. This hasn't occurred in this trial. Why? We've had a lot of questions like this with people saying, how come these cases are being brought before the court?
Well, you've mentioned it already, no jury. You cannot influence a judge. So that's why. Although this has been very, very heavily covered, this trial, there's always dangers there that you can perhaps influence a witness, as was alluded to yesterday when the woman said she was challenged by the defence that she had not mentioned Telstra in her first statement, but had only done so in one that was given a couple of years ago, and she said, I may have been influenced by a newspaper article when he was arrested. So he said she's added the Telstra in afterwards. So there's that type of thing that we've got to be careful of. Also, he won't do the sentencing. If there was a jury, you would never have heard of these charges.
No.
We would have been suppressed. And that sentencing, which he's alluded to now, is being right towards the end of the trial, and he's talking about legal argument to do the 5 charges that he's admitted to. That's been pushed back to later.
So this is the word that Ali mentioned just a short time ago, propensity evidence. So, and it's illegal. It's an illegal occurrence, which means that in certain circumstances, judges in particular, but sometimes juries are allowed to hear of previous offences, but they've got to be very similar. They've got to be of such strong probative value, as they call it in court, to basically allow the full picture of the person who's on trial to occur. And we've made many references to the pre-trial hearings, and one of the pre-trial hearings was just on propensity evidence.
Yep.
And both sides had to stand up. Miss Barbara Gallo mostly because she was the one who wanted to bring the evidence in, because she's the one who's having to prove all these allegations. She had to stand up and say, Your Honour, this is what we want to bring in, and this is why. And it took days. Of arguments, and it included the Huntingdale attack.
Yep.
It included the Karrakatta rape. It included what we previously referred to as the Huntingdale prowler evidence, which when Mr. Edwards hadn't pleaded guilty to Huntingdale, they were going to bring all this batch of evidence about these 9 or 10 or 11 weird break-ins, all in the sort of 1 square kilometre, one of which was the theft of that kimono off a washing line about 2 weeks before the Huntingdale break-in. So Ali's absolutely right. It's rare, because when you get a jury, you want to keep them as pure as possible. You want them to just focus on what's said in court, on the evidence that's said in court, and you don't want any outside influences, which is why the Cardinal Pell case. That's the case that everyone will know, and everyone was asking, well, why is it suppressed? Is it the church trying to keep it secret? No, it was a judge saying there's going to be 2 separate trials of 2 separate accusers, and so if the jury in this second trial, a potential jury in this second trial, hear all the stuff in the first trial, that's going to influence them to such a degree that there's no way they can have a fair trial. So that's why that was kept secret. It was nothing to do with the Catholic Church trying to keep it under wraps. And if this had been a jury trial, Ali's absolutely right. We probably wouldn't. None of this would probably be in public until it's actually heard in court. None of the pre-trial hearings would have been public, or it would all been suppressed to maintain the sanctity of the jury. But in this case, because it was a judge alone, and because the judge was very aware of the public interest, he allowed all that pre-trial stuff to be aired, and then he made the decision. I think that's relevant. I think that's not. Some listeners might remember there was a whole swag of stuff about some porn that was found in Mr. Edwards' house. The judge ruled all that out, and so we're not going to hear about that again. We probably won't report on it again because it's irrelevant to the process that's going on.
But today he was okay to show us the white station wagons, which were part of a very intensive police hunt.
So we got, as Ali said, we got pictures of the car that Mr. Edwards owned before the Holden Commodore station wagon, which is basically the car that the prosecution are going to say that Sarah got into. It's slightly different. I mean, it's of a type, white station wagon, but this is a Toyota Camry rather than a Holden Commodore. Today we also got a picture of Jane's watch that was found after, around the time that she went missing. And we also got new pictures, police pictures of the kimono. So those were the 4 that he released today that he felt would aid the media reporting.
Because we're required almost to put legal submissions in every day. I didn't expect that.
Yeah.
I have to explain why we need it, what we're going to use it for. It's quite a thorough submission that we have to do.
Well, I mean, nothing about this case is ordinary, is it?
Not at all.
So everything about it is extraordinary.
We've called it historic, and that's what it is, groundbreaking in every which way.
Yeah. Well, so yesterday we heard a lot about Sarah and her final day and her final movements and the last people to see her alive. Today there was Jane Rimmer's family and their statements.
That's right, yes. We had her parents give a statement. Her brother actually took the stand and he testified his last words to her again on a long weekend. It was June 1996, a long weekend. He'd spoken to her and he identified the actual watch, which was later found in Wellard near her body. He was the last one to talk about her, and we went on. We just got a bit of a background on what had happened. She was a daycare worker in Nedlands. Again, like all the girls, happy, no problems anywhere, and obviously very trusting.
Yeah.
You know, this is what does my head in. You might have talked about this, the Telstra It keeps coming up. I can't understand why the police didn't put out some sort of warning. They were happy to sort of like the whole taxi industry come under suspicion. Even if somebody had mentioned a Telstra logo on the white van, it might have stopped someone from getting. I mean, that is quite a distinctive logo.
Yeah. And and as Ellie said, so we got the statements of Jane's parents, Trevor and Jennifer, were read in. Trevor's actually no longer with us, unfortunately. So to hear a statement of a father who lost a daughter and then lost his own battle with cancer many years later was interesting in itself.
When were these statements made, Tim?
So both Jennifer's and
Very
Trevor's major statements were in the days after, and then
Right.
Jennifer had done another little one just to confirm her earlier statement was made when it was. And yeah, I mean, you just get the impression of another close family, normal childhood, loved her work, good friends, great social life, enjoyed a beer, just your archetypal West Australian woman who then just vanished. And as we said, with Sarah's close family sort of statements, you could sort of sense the bewilderment in the raw words that they were telling the police. And then Adam's testimony in person today, he was very matter of fact. Didn't go into too much detail, but I mean, the fact that he had a memory of Jane going to her parents' house the day before to get her washing done and get her feed, and he just said, well, she liked freebies, as any young 23-year-old just starting out does, still sort of lean on mum and dad quite a lot.
Because as you remember back, it was only when Jane disappeared that the police started to look at a pattern. After Sarah, I remember all the reporters were out there where they had her photograph up. They thought she had just gone missing. And her sister yesterday put in a missing persons report and read that out. It wasn't until Jane went that there seemed to be, hey, she looked a bit like Sarah Spears. Police are very reluctant to mention the word serial killer. I found that over the Bernies and other cases. I don't know whether it's a strategy, they don't want to be focused on one thing, but serial killer never came into the picture until well after Jane, and then Kira. Yeah. That was the definite one. But with Sarah, they were putting out posters. They thought she just maybe had gone off for a couple of days or so. It was quite awful, the search for her.
It's almost, it seems like the two girls that we've heard their last days of, Sarah and Jane, their days seemed quite similar, their last days. They've both, these young girls, they've gone to the pub for a drink. They've both ended up in this place called Claremont.
Same as Kira too,
Yeah, and those are the similarities that basically, the absolute stack of similarities that the prosecution are going to point to and say it couldn't have been, there can't be another person out there. This is the prosecution's argument. There can't be another person out there
driving a Telstra.
Well, what are the chances? Basically, I mean that's the prosecution's sort of ultimate circumstantial case. Is what are the chances?
When was the alarm raised with Jane? Is that in the statements?
It was she was supposed to come for Sunday lunch.
Well, both families are such close families that they missed them straight away. They were meant to do things the very next day. Some families, if they'd gone for a week, you might think, oh, well, they've gone off with their friends. But no, these were very, very close families. They were both, I think Sarah was meant to turn up for lunch the next day, as was with Jane. So they knew within 24 hours that they hadn't come home.
Yeah.
And they obviously, I guess that was the day they called police on the Sunday.
Well, it was a long weekend, so whether the police, like with Sarah, they don't jump straight into thinking it's a murder. They think, oh, she'll turn up, she's gone away with her friend, she's, that sort of thing. They don't react. It was only after Jane that they started looking, I think.
From memory, reading the archived copy of the West Australian at the time, it was that Monday, when the coverage in the newspaper at the time was just from the Monday was just off the charts because, it was just obvious the similarities between the cases. Young girls, blonde, slim, attractive, Claremont, missing, weekend.
And that's when we start to link it. I remember getting a call from Howard Gretton at the time saying, who's now with the police, he said, another girl, have a look at them, they look the same.
Yeah.
And they've both gone from the same area, which is my area. So he rang me and I said, this is my neighbourhood. And he said, have a look at this. This can't be a coincidence.
Were you linking it in the media before the police?
We were, yes.
And I think, during the trial, even though we're 10 days in, I think we've learned enough about the investigation that on the surface the police might have been being very careful, but I think it was becoming obvious to them quite early on that they were dealing with something completely out of the ordinary.
I found it very interesting. One of the witnesses today was a woman who worked at Telstra, but she was a hairdresser. Why was she significant?
Well, the hair, we've discussed the...
But also she worked for Telstra and she had to say she didn't wear blue fibres in.
What are the chances? Yeah. So this was the hairdresser that Jane had booked an appointment with on the morning before she went missing. She kept that appointment. She had her hair washed and cut, and she was obviously very memorable to this lady who gave evidence today. And there's obviously a couple of things significant of that. The hair. So in the distant future, or maybe not too distant future, we're going to hear a lot about Jane's hair and particularly the fibres that were in it. And what the prosecution will point to is that, they couldn't have been that long-standing fibres in there because she'd had her hair washed and cut less than 12 hours before she went missing. But this hairdresser just happened to work at Telstra as well, but not as a technician climbing up poles, but as a retail salesperson basically. And so it was a very clever question from Mr. Jovich. He stood up and said, "You mentioned you worked for Telstra. Did you wear a uniform?"
Was it
because
blue?
there's one blue fibre that the prosecution will allege was in Jane's hair, which matches these Telstra Yaka shorts stroke pants. And if she had said, "Oh yeah, they used to give us a uniform to work in the shop," I don't know what would have happened, but there would have been a gasp around the courtroom. But she said, "No, we just wore our civvies to work, and they let us wear what we wanted."
Well, maybe before we leave for this week's last podcast, we could just recap some of the evidence that we've heard this week and some of those things that people have found very interesting. And I guess one was what we were just talking about, the fact that police were looking into these Telstra cars decades ago.
Yeah, so I think that's going to become, that's just going to be a running theme throughout the trial. What Mr. Edwards was driving, when he was driving it, and once again, it goes back to the fibres, particularly, only for Kira and Jane, obviously. There will be a lot of talk about inserts and footwells and upholstery because that is where the fibres come from, or so to say, the prosecution.
We've certainly raked over his entire history. We heard shown everything from his birth certificate right through all of his rosters, his applications, his pay slips,
everything.
The prosecution is putting everything out there that can possibly be challenged.
Also, very interesting this week was hearing from these Telstra living witnesses, these women who were, offered lifts and took lifts with a man in a Telstra car. Yeah,
and we'd heard a lot about them, but until you actually hear, back to back, all their separate accounts of different nights, but there were striking similarities between them, you've got to say. Late at night, Stirling Highway was mentioned, over and over and over. White car, Telstra logo, and the description of the man was broadly similar. But there were a couple of holes punched in those accounts as well. Particularly we've mentioned it earlier in the week, the identikit picture, which some say looks like him, some say don't.
This brings us to a question that has come up from a lot of listeners. We've been sent an enormous amount of emails about this one. So I'm just going to give you the question from Linton Jones, which really sums up a whole lot of listeners' questions. And he says, "I'm wondering if the Telstra living witnesses have been asked to identify the person who picked them up. If so, what was the result? Did they point to the accused, or does that only happen in movies?"
No, that only happens in movies, because we're talking about the accused 30, 25 years on. He
Yes.
would have looked nothing like, well, none of the witnesses look like what they look like when you were 20. These people were all in their 20s. Now they're all in their 50s.
Yes.
They're bank managers. They're heads of CEOs of companies. There's no way you would have been able to point to him and say,
Yes.
that's him. A week later, yes.
I
Not
think
23 years later.
People have this idea that, someone stands in the courtroom and says, and is this the man that you remember from
No.
30 years ago?
I mean, it would have been a lovely
And it doesn't
dramatic
wrap up
moment.
in an hour and a half either.
Unfortunately not. No. The short answer to the question is no, they weren't asked. But I think that wasn't someone not doing their job. I think it might have been someone who was doing their job.
And what was Bradley Edwards' demeanour in court this week overall?
Pretty well the same, isn't it?
Yeah, he was more, as we said, he was more animated at the start of the week. He's been taking notes all week. I watched him quite closely today when the Huntingdale victim was giving her evidence, and he
looked down.
Yeah, he was looking down, stock still,
Yep.
stock
Yes.
still, not a movement. Didn't maybe. Well,
He didn't look up at her.
didn't
he-
acknowledge her. Was listening
Yeah.
very intently, but wasn't wasn't staring or
No, just looked down.
anything that could be seen to be anything other than what he's been most of the trial.
Actually, it's just his colleagues that he's shown a bit of interest, but he's watched them walk out, and they've just been ones who he's worked with over the years and had drinks with.
Well, week 2 has obviously been nothing short of extraordinary. I think if week 1 was dramatic and there were bombshells, I think
was
week
quite
2 was quite
gruelling,
emotional
yeah.
and
Yeah,
gruelling.
it was a massive week. I mean, and I don't think even the lawyers expected to get through that many witnesses.
Yeah.
The sort of court watchers certainly didn't. But they are making good progress, and Ms. Barbagallo said yesterday that she was quite happy with the speed it was going, but she warned us all again that once we hit the DNA, we're going to slow
down.
right down.
All right. Well, thank you both for all your hard work this week. It has been gruelling. Thanks to everyone for listening in, and we'll be back on Monday with week 3 of the trial. If you'd like to contact us in the meantime, you can get us at Claremont Podcast at wanews.com.au, and we'll chat Monday.
This podcast was hosted by Natalie Bongiorlo, produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy, and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.